Every time you look in the mirror, you probably think you're looking at a good person, someone who tries their best, who helps others when they can. But St. Augustine, one of history's most influential philosophers, would strongly disagree. In fact, he discovered something so dark about human nature that it changed Christianity forever. Picture this. It's the year 370 AD, and a teenage boy sneaks into his neighbor's garden at night. He's not hungry. His family is wealthy. Yet he and his friends steal pears from a tree, take one bite each, and throw the rest to the pigs. This boy was Augustine himself, and this simple act of theft would haunt him for the rest of his life. Why? Because he realized he stole those pears not out of need, not out of hunger, but simply because it was wrong. He did evil for evil's sake. This might seem like a small thing, just a teenage prank. But Augustine saw something deeper. Think about the last time you scrolled through social media and felt a hint of joy at someone else's failure, or that moment when you could have helped someone struggling with their groceries, but you pretended not to notice because you were in a hurry, or when you shared a juicy piece of gossip, knowing it might hurt someone's reputation. We all do these things, and we all have perfect excuses for them. I was tired. Everyone does it. They probably deserved it. Augustine spent years studying human behavior, not just in others, but in himself, and he came to a shocking conclusion. We don't just do bad things because we're weak or because we're pressured. We often choose to do them because somewhere deep inside, we enjoy the power that comes from causing harm. This isn't just ancient philosophy. Modern psychology backs this up. Studies show that when people think they won't get caught, their moral behavior drops significantly. In one famous experiment, people who found a lost letter with money in it were far less likely to return it if they believed there was no way to trace them. It wasn't about need. It was about the thrill of getting away with something wrong. Augustine's discovery terrified him because it meant something that most of us don't want to admit. The darkness in human nature isn't just a small flaw we can fix with some positive thinking and good habits. It's woven into the very fabric of who we are. And if you think you're the exception, well, that's exactly what Augustine thought too, until he took a hard look at his own soul. But here's where it gets really interesting. Augustine wasn't just some pessimist who wanted everyone to feel bad about themselves. His dark truth about human nature was actually the first step towards something much more powerful, a completely different way of understanding ourselves and finding real goodness. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what he discovered and why it might be the most important thing you learn about yourself today. Just remember, if you're feeling a bit uncomfortable right now, that's exactly how Augustine wanted you to feel, because sometimes the most important truths are the ones we're least willing to face. Think about the most dangerous person you know. Maybe it's that manipulative coworker or that friend who betrayed your trust. Now here's Augustine's terrifying insight. The real danger isn't them. It's the fact that you think you're different from them. This self-deception is exactly what Augustine warns us about, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Let me show you what I mean. In 386 AD, Augustine was at the peak of his career in Milan. He had everything: wealth, reputation, influence, even a beautiful girlfriend. By all outward measures, he was a good person. He taught others how to live virtuous lives, gave to charity, and was respected by everyone who knew him. But late at night, alone with his thoughts, Augustine was terrified, not of others, but of himself. In his private writings, which would later become Confessions, he describes a moment that changed everything. He was walking in his garden, listening to a child's sing-song voice saying, "Take up and read." He picked up a Bible and randomly opened it. The passage he read exposed every lie he'd been telling himself about his own goodness. He realized that all his virtuous actions were just a mask, hiding something much darker. This isn't just ancient history. Think about Bernie Madoff. Before he was caught running the biggest Ponzi scheme in history, he was chairman of NASDAQ, respected by everyone, donated millions to charity. Even his closest friends thought he was a good person. More importantly, he thought he was a good person. That's what made him so dangerous. Or consider the Stanford prison experiment, where ordinary college students turned into brutal guards within days. They didn't think they were capable of cruelty. That's exactly what made them capable of it. Augustine would say this isn't surprising at all. It's exactly what happens when we believe in our own inherent goodness. The stakes are personal too. Every time you justify a small lie, every time you convince yourself that your anger is righteous, every time you dismiss your own bad behavior while judging others harshly, you're falling into the trap Augustine warned about. The more convinced you are of your own goodness, the more blind you become to your capacity for evil. But here's where Augustine's insight becomes truly revolutionary. He discovered that this crushing realization that we're not as good as we think we are isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. Only when we stop believing in our own natural goodness can we start becoming truly good. And in the next segments, I'll show you exactly how this works, starting with Augustine's most famous story about the darkest corners of human nature. The real question isn't whether you're capable of evil. Augustine would say that's obvious. The real question is, are you brave enough to admit it? Because what comes next might change everything you think you know about being a good person. Let's go back to that pear tree for a moment. Augustine was obsessed with this seemingly minor incident from his youth, but not for the reason you might think. He had done far worse things. He'd stolen more valuable items, told bigger lies, hurt people he loved. But those pears, they revealed something that kept him awake at night. See, when you steal food because you're hungry, that makes sense. When you lie to protect someone's feelings, you can justify that. But Augustine and his friends weren't hungry. They didn't even want the pears, they threw them to the pigs. They stole simply because it was wrong, and they laughed about it. This isn't just some ancient teenager's confession. Look at what happens on social media today. People don't just disagree with others, they enjoy destroying them. Take ratioing someone on Twitter. The whole point isn't to correct wrong information or fight injustice. It's the pure pleasure of public humiliation. Augustine would recognize this instantly, the joy of doing harm for harm's sake. But it gets worse. Modern psychology has proven Augustine right in ways he couldn't have imagined. In a famous experiment called the Joy of Destruction game, researchers gave participants the choice to spend their own money to destroy someone else's earnings. The shocking part, up to 40% of people chose to harm others, even when they gained absolutely nothing from it. Sound familiar, Augustine? Think this doesn't apply to you? Let's try something. Remember the last time someone you dislike made a mistake at work? Did you feel a tiny spark of pleasure? Or when that perfect couple on Instagram finally broke up? Was there a small part of you that enjoyed their pain? Augustine would say these aren't accidents or character flaws. They're glimpses of our true nature. But here's where it gets really interesting. Studies have shown that the people most likely to act cruelly are often those who are most convinced of their own moral superiority. In fact, the more someone believes in their own goodness, the more likely they are to dehumanize others. Augustine saw this in himself. As a young man, he believed so strongly in his own righteousness that he joined a strict religious sect, looking down on everyone else as morally inferior. Remember that coworker who's always talking about how honest they are? Augustine would say, watch out for them first. The person always posting about their good deeds on social media? That's exactly the kind of self-deception he warned about. The louder someone proclaims their own goodness, the more likely they are to be blind to their own darkness. But Augustine isn't just trying to make us feel terrible about ourselves. He's doing something much more sophisticated. By showing us this dark truth about human nature, he's actually opening the door to real moral growth. Because once you stop believing in the illusion of your own natural goodness, once you stop thinking you're better than others, something remarkable happens. You can finally start becoming genuinely good. This is why Augustine's insight was revolutionary. He wasn't just describing human nature. He was showing us how our belief in our own goodness is often the biggest obstacle to actually becoming good. And in our age of virtue signaling and moral grandstanding, this message is more relevant than ever. Where does evil come from? Most people point to external factors, bad parenting, poverty, trauma, or social pressure. But Augustine discovered something far more disturbing. He looked at babies, those supposedly innocent bundles of joy, and saw something that troubled him deeply. Have you ever really watched a baby when they don't get what they want? They scream, they hit, they bite. Even before they can talk, they try to dominate others. Augustine noticed that no one teaches babies to be selfish. They're born that way. No one has to teach a toddler to lie or be jealous of their sibling. It comes naturally. Modern developmental psychology backs this up in fascinating ways. Studies show that children as young as 6 months old show preference for those who harm people they see as different. By age 3, children will often choose to sacrifice their own rewards just to make sure another child gets less than them. Sound familiar? It's Augustine's pear tree all over again. Harm for harm's sake. But it gets even more interesting. Researchers at Yale's baby lab discovered something shocking. Babies actually prefer mean puppets over nice ones. As long as those mean puppets are harming someone the baby sees as different. No one taught them this. No one corrupted them. They came preloaded with these tendencies. Augustine would say, "See, this is exactly what I was talking about." He called it original sin, but you don't need to be religious to see his point. We're not born as blank slates that society corrupts. We're born with built-in software for selfishness, dominance, and cruelty. The real miracle isn't why people do bad things. It's why they ever do good things. Think about your own childhood memories. When did someone first have to tell you to share? When did you first feel the urge to lie to avoid punishment? Augustine would bet it was far earlier than you remember. He'd point out that we don't need to be taught to be selfish. We need years of training just to become basically decent. This is why just be yourself might be the worst moral advice ever given. Augustine would argue that being yourself, your natural, untrained self, means being dominated by these innate tendencies toward evil. Real goodness isn't natural at all. It's artificial, learned, practiced. It goes against our default settings. But here's where Augustine's insight becomes unexpectedly hopeful. If evil tendencies are natural, then feeling bad about having them is pointless. It's like feeling guilty for getting hungry or tired. The question isn't why do I have these impulses, but rather, what am I going to do about them? This completely changes the game. Instead of pretending we're naturally good people who occasionally mess up, we can finally be honest. We're naturally mess-up people who have to work hard at being good. And surprisingly, this honest self-awareness is the first step toward real change. Think of it like this. You can't fix a problem you won't admit exists. Augustine's harsh truth about human nature isn't meant to condemn us. It's meant to wake us up to what we're really dealing with. Because only when we stop being shocked by our capacity for evil can we start doing the real work of becoming good. Imagine being locked in a prison where you're completely free to escape, but you keep choosing to stay. Sounds crazy, right? But according to Augustine, this is exactly our situation when it comes to being good. We have free will, we can choose whatever we want, and that's precisely the problem. Here's what Augustine noticed. Every morning you wake up and have complete freedom to be a better person. You can choose to be patient, kind, and honest. Yet by lunchtime, you've probably already snapped at someone, thought mean thoughts, or told a small lie. Why? Augustine's answer is mind-bending. We freely choose evil, even when we have the option to choose good. Think about your New Year's resolutions. Every January, millions of people freely choose to become better versions of themselves. By February, most of those resolutions are dead. It's not that someone forced you to quit, you chose to. Augustine would say this isn't just about weak willpower. It's about a deeper problem. We're free to choose, but something in us loves choosing wrong. Modern neuroscience has stumbled onto something Augustine figured out 1,600 years ago. Scientists can now see that our brains often make decisions before we're consciously aware of them. In one famous experiment, researchers could predict participants' choices 7 seconds before they felt they had made the decision. Free will exists, but it's not what we think it is. Let's get personal for a moment. Think about that bad habit you've been trying to break. You know it's harmful. You're completely free to stop, yet something in you keeps choosing it, over and over. Augustine would say, "Welcome to the human condition." We're like someone with a gambling addiction standing in front of a casino, technically free to walk away, but almost certainly going to go in. This is why simple willpower fails. It's why just try harder is terrible advice. Augustine saw that our free will is like a compass that's drawn to the wrong pole. We can fight it, but our natural pull is towards self-destruction. Every time you freely choose to scroll social media instead of doing something meaningful, every time you freely choose to hold on to a grudge instead of forgiving, you're proving Augustine right. But here's where it gets really interesting. Augustine says this broken free will isn't a design flaw. It's actually crucial for understanding how to become truly good, because once you realize that your free will naturally pulls toward evil, you stop relying on it so much. You stop thinking you can just choose to be good through sheer willpower. Instead, you start building systems and supports outside your free will. Just like a recovering addict needs a support group, not just willpower. Becoming good requires more than just good intentions. It requires admitting that your free will isn't enough, that you need help, that you need training and practice and accountability. This is why Augustine would laugh at most self-help books. Just choose to be positive. Just decide to change. He'd say that's like telling a compass to just decide to point south. Real change requires understanding that our free will is part of the problem, not the whole solution. And in the next segment, I'll show you exactly what Augustine suggests we do about this predicament. Looking in an actual mirror is easy, but really seeing yourself? That's what Augustine spent years learning how to do, and what he discovered nearly drove him mad. Not because he was especially evil, but because he finally saw through all his own excuses, justifications, and self-deception. Augustine developed a method of self-examination that was brutal in its honesty. Instead of the feel-good self-reflection we do today, what are my strengths? What am I passionate about? He asked questions that cut to the bone. Why do I really help others? Is it genuine compassion? Or do I want to feel superior? Why do I get angry at other people's flaws when I have the same ones? Try this experiment, Augustine suggested. For one day, keep track of every time you blame someone else for something. Your spouse for your bad mood, traffic for your lateness, your parents for your fears, society for your failures. Augustine found that we're masters at shifting responsibility. He called it the chain of blame that goes all the way back to Adam blaming Eve and Eve blaming the serpent. Modern psychology has a term for this: fundamental attribution error. When others mess up, we blame their character. When we mess up, we blame circumstances. Augustine saw this pattern everywhere. We're like actors in a play who've forgotten we're wearing masks, believing our own disguises. Here's where Augustine gets really uncomfortable. He suggests looking at the things that make you angry in others. That person who's always showing off? Your anger might be showing you your own hidden pride. That friend who betrayed you? Look closer at how many times you've betrayed others' trust in small ways. It's like having a spiritual mirror that shows you your own flaws in the things you hate about others. But Augustine wasn't just being negative. He found that this harsh self-knowledge was actually liberating. Think about it. How much energy do you spend maintaining your self-image, defending your actions, explaining away your mistakes? Augustine discovered that when you finally stop pretending to be good, you have so much more energy for actually becoming good. This is why most self-improvement fails. It's built on self-deception. We try to add new habits without facing our old ones. We recite positive affirmations while ignoring negative patterns. It's like putting expensive furniture in a house with a crumbling foundation. Augustine would say start with the foundation, brutal self-honesty. The strangest part? People who followed Augustine's method of radical self-honesty often found themselves becoming more compassionate toward others. Once you stop pretending to be perfect, you can finally stop demanding perfection from everyone else. Real self-knowledge doesn't lead to self-hatred. It leads to a kind of freedom. Because once you see yourself clearly, you can finally start changing what you see. And that's exactly what we'll explore in our final segment: how Augustine's dark truth about human nature actually opens the door to genuine transformation. Because sometimes, the path to light starts in the darkest place of all: honest self-knowledge. Everything we've learned about human nature so far sounds pretty dark, right? But this is where Augustine pulls his greatest twist. He says that accepting our darkness is actually the key to finding real hope. Not the fake optimism of everyone is basically good, but something much more powerful. Think about it like addiction recovery. No one ever got sober while pretending they didn't have a drinking problem. Augustine says real change starts the same way, by admitting how bad things really are. But here's the beautiful part. Once you stop using all your energy to maintain a good person image, you can finally start becoming genuinely good. Augustine discovered this through his own messy journey. After his garden moment, when he finally admitted how dark his own heart was, something unexpected happened. He felt relief. All the energy he'd spent pretending to be good justifying his actions, maintaining his image. It was all suddenly available for actual change. Here's a modern example. Studies show that people who believe willpower is limited actually end up showing more self-control than people who think they have unlimited willpower. Why? Because they stop relying on their own strength and start building systems to help them. Augustine would say, "Exactly. That's what I've been trying to tell you." This is where Augustine's approach differs from modern self-help. Instead of saying, "You're already perfect, just believe in yourself," he says you're deeply flawed, and that's exactly where hope begins. It's like building a house. You don't start by decorating the walls. You start by digging down to solid ground, even if that means going through a lot of dirt first. But Augustine takes it even further. He noticed that people who admitted their own darkness tended to become more compassionate toward others. Think about it. When you're honest about your own flaws, you stop being so shocked and judgmental about everyone else's. Real humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. This explains something that might seem puzzling: why some of the kindest, most genuinely good people you'll ever meet are also the ones most aware of their own flaws. They're not good because they believe in their own goodness. They're good because they stopped believing in it and started working on actual goodness instead. Augustine would look at our modern world of Instagram filters and carefully curated social media personas and laugh. We're doing it exactly backward, trying to look good instead of being good. He'd say real hope isn't found in denying the darkness, but in facing it honestly, because only then can we stop being trapped by it. And here's the most hopeful part. Once you accept that you're not naturally good, you can finally stop feeling guilty about finding it hard to be good. Instead of beating yourself up for failing to be perfect, you can focus on progress. It's like learning to play an instrument. No one expects to be naturally good at it. You expect to practice, to make mistakes, to gradually improve. This is Augustine's ultimate message of hope. Real goodness isn't about being perfect, it's about being honest. And sometimes, the darkest truths, when faced with courage, light the way to the brightest futures.